Get started if that works for our group. Guys, good? Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Just wanted to welcome you. My name is Suzette Malveaux, and I'm the director of the Byron White Center for the Study of American Constitutional Law. And I'm really excited that you're here with us for our fall speaker series. We have some folks that are brilliant and are at the forefront of some of the most pressing issues today that are going on in our country in terms of democracy and constitutional law. When we think about police reform and Black Lives Matter, issues related to citizenship, protest lawyering, voting rights and COVID-19, and critical race theory. So we have just an amazing lineup of folks that will be sharing their thoughts and insights with us during this time. I am deeply indebted to Professor Doug Spencer for organizing this. He's done a wonderful job of bringing people together. He is our distinguished faculty fellow with the Byron White Center this year. So thank you, Doug. I'm also really pleased to say that we are co-sponsoring this event with BALSA. And so I do want to thank the co-president of BALSA, Van Michael Moore, and the other co-president of BALSA, Kende Winful. So I really appreciate their participation. And I'm just really thankful Professor Monica Bell is here with us to unpack notions of police reform in the context of Black Lives Matter. This is an important issue for me. I know that we are at a crossroads in this country and in the state of Colorado. This summer, I had the opportunity to testify against qualified immunity pertaining to our own reform bill and to write in support of liability for bystander cops. So I'm really interested in what you have to bring to the table, and I appreciate your time. Let me turn this over to Professor Spencer, who will be moderating today, and we'll take it from there. So thank you.
Thanks, Professor Malveaux. Good morning, everybody. It's really nice to see all of you here today. I'm so glad you're here to join us for this talk. A few logistical points just at the outset. I'll be moderating the question and answer. So if you can use either the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions, either as they pop into your mind during the talk or afterwards. And then I'll be tracking that, and we'll read those questions to Professor Bell so everybody can hear them and she can answer them when the time comes. Also, Professor Malveaux and I will turn off our cameras once Professor Bell starts speaking, but it's also, I would recommend for you to click on the speaker view so at least Professor Bell's face and room is visible to you without all the other icons to distract you. Of course, that's up to you. I want to draw people's attention quickly as I introduce Professor Bell to yesterday's front page story in the New York Times, a deep dive into the Breonna Taylor story. It's the front page and the centerfold piece. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, I really encourage you to do so. Like a lot of these events, her murder involves controversial and contested details, and it's really a fascinating read about how people are grappling with what's going on in Louisville. But what really stuck out to me in the story related to today was the fact that the Louisville Police Department's been in some kind of reform effort for 40 years, including a consent decree in the 1980s. Even as recently as 2018, the police chief was asking people, please come, reformers, can you help us figure out how to do policing better? And there was a quote from a state representative in Kentucky who said at the end of these 40 years of reform, the trauma of it, the reality of it just set in for so many of us that this agency isn't really built for us. This was a Black representative in the state legislature. And I can't think of anybody in the entire country that I would want to help me unpack that statement more than Monica Bell. And so I'm just incredibly excited that she's here to help us think about these issues and the way that policing interacts with the communities that they serve. Professor Bell is a first-generation college graduate from upstate South Carolina, which is where she attended college, Furman University. Her scholarship aims to center the voices and experiences of people who are excluded in the law. She's written about policing and criminal justice, housing discrimination, welfare, and poverty. Her research also illustrates how we cannot understand the relationship between police departments and the communities they serve without accounting for the lived realities of poverty and inequality. Professor Bell earned a graduate degree in equality studies at University College Dublin on a Mitchell Scholarship, a law degree from Yale Law School, and a PhD in sociological and policy studies from Harvard University. She's currently associate professor at Yale with a joint appointment at Yale Law and the Department of Sociology. And as I said, could not be more thrilled to have her join, at least virtually today, the Colorado community to share her thoughts about policing and police reform in the era of Black Lives Matter. So with that, I will turn the time over to you, Monica. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Doug and Suzette. I'm really, really honored to be here in dialogue with both of you. And also with the broader community. Thank you so much for spending your time this way. So what I'm going to do in this moment of talking is to discuss the fundamental issues that I think a lot of recent incidents reveal, but none of these incidents are new, even though people are, I think, are newly paying attention to them, and talk about this in like kind of in light of what is actually underlying what we're seeing, why usual approaches to reform haven't worked. And I think the Breonna Taylor story and what has been going on in Louisville is an excellent example of this as well, even though I'm going to talk mostly about Baltimore right now. And also, I'm going to spend the first part of the talk on that, and then I'm going to spend some time talking about understanding the nature of the change that's needed and why this moment is a really exciting one for people who care, who kind of see the broader picture of police reform in a conversation about what meaningful racial justice is. But I'm going to step back from that now, but that's the general structure of the talk. So I'm going to start with an article that I wrote and published in 2017 called Police Reform and the Dismantling of Legal Estrangement. And what I do in that article is criticize the primary modality then. I think things have shifted a bit, but then at that point, the conversation that was really started in the movement for Black Lives in 2013, 2014, 2015. At that point, kind of in around 2015, the conversation shifted nationally to really focus on notions of what are called procedural justice and legitimacy. And the basic idea of the legitimacy movement is that the relationship between police and the communities they serve is frayed. And the problem is that people don't have a sense of trust or legitimacy in the police. And that is framed as the problem. And then the solution that is primarily advocated from that position is called procedural justice. And that means a bundle of different things, and I would never want to oversimplify the idea. But police, but the core idea is that it focuses on how individuals experience an interaction with the police. It's a social psychological theory that is really grounded in that interactional relationship. And there's a lot of survey data that supports this idea that if police engage in procedurally just behavior, then an individual sense that the police have behaved in a legitimate way, that seems to be kind of borne out by that evidence. But the problem with that, it's like that might be true, but based on the research I've done, so as Doug mentioned, I kind of work from a position of law and sociology. So I engage in qualitative research with marginalized communities and learn from them about how they experience the state in general, including the police. And one of the things that came up over and over again is that a lot of people sensed that the police were not quote unquote legitimate or could not be trusted or were harmful, didn't have anything to do with these direct individual interactions. And so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories to frame this out a little more clearly. So two stories from research that I, with a team, conducted in Baltimore in the wake of the death of Freddie Gray in 2015. So I'm going to start with Roland. So Roland, who is 22 years old, grew up splitting time between his grandmother's house in East Baltimore and his mother's home in West Baltimore. Unlike many of his friends, family members, and neighbors, he has been able to avoid most criminal justice involvement. He has never even been arrested, despite being stopped, questioned, and frisked on numerous occasions. But being stopped is a part of daily life, in Roland's view. It's something he has adapted to. Honestly, he said, it's just a part of living in the city. You just see them. They flash that bright light on you. You just start emptying your pockets. You just grow up not liking the police. It's just the MO, I guess. Notice this has very little to do with a direct interaction. So when Roland was younger, he marveled at these stops, not because of how he was treated during them, but because he was being stopped at all. He told us, I was scared because I was younger, so I was like, why are they bothering me? I can understand if I was doing something wrong, but I didn't give them a reason to. But even then, no actual stop was necessary for the message of social control to be conveyed. Roland said, oh man, let it be like 5 Black little kids. They're going to at least throw the light on y'all just to see if there's something going on. They might not even get out, but they're going to flash that bright light, spotlight on you, just to let you guys know that they see you. But being stopped and even being monitored is only part of Roland's concern. Another issue is that police do not share the concerns of poor communities, marginalized communities in terms of stopping crime. So according to Roland, police care about narcotics dealing, pretty much, but everything else that people in Baltimore experience is not a priority. So Roland explained that, quote, it depends on the neighborhood. He says, I worked at Harbor East. You call the police down there, they're going to be there in 5 minutes flat. They're going to come to that area quick because there's a lot of money in that area. You have a lot of successful people. Here, please. They're down the street and they're still going to take forever. But life goes on, Roland explained. It's just how it is. Now, what are some of the things you might pull out from this story about Roland? So what becomes very clear is that his way of thinking about the police is not really informed primarily by direct interactions with the police. It's more these notions, it's these ideas that because I am Black and because people in my community are Black, the police are going to pay extra attention to us. They want to shine a bright spotlight on you to let you know that you're being watched and surveilled. They don't actually care about the concerns you really have. And there are people about whom they do have concerns. So the people who live in Harbor East. This profound sense of being policed, not because of any behavior or not because of crime, but because of race and because of class. And also this sense that there are people who are being protected, right? So I think a lot of times in conversations about inequality, we focus on the experiences that the marginalized people have without recognizing that the story is not just one about deprivation, it's also a sense of inequality, it's a sense of non-belongingness. And so that's one of the core impulses of a legal estrangement perspective. And I'm going to tell you one more story. I'm going to tell you the story now of Richard, and I talk about Richard in a more recent article called Anti-Segregation Policing that just came out this June. And so Richard is also a young person in Baltimore. He and a group of his friends on a kind of boring, hot summer day decided to go for a long walk. So they went to a friend's house that lived far away, and then like, I'm sure you remember being a kid and just kind of wandering around in the summer, and they did that. So they were in an area where there isn't public transportation and they didn't have any money. So they just kind of walked for hours and took a lot of breaks along the way. And as they were walking, they eventually kind of walked into an affluent white neighborhood, and they were stunned by how opulent the houses were. They figured that they had never seen the neighborhood and wanted to get a glimpse of life from a different vantage point. So they just went in, walked around, and just observed everything. So the neighborhood was actually near a golf course, and Richard and his friends were particularly impressed by the swimming pools. So he said, they had pools and stuff. We didn't know pools were out there. We didn't know how nice it was. So he was just looking around, just looking, just roaming the streets, just looking at everything. So perhaps unsurprisingly, given the American racial hierarchy, a group of teenaged African-American boys strolling through this all-white neighborhood, kind of gazing admiringly at the houses and yards attracted suspicion, and eventually somebody called the police. So when the officer arrived, at least according to Richard, she was calm and pleasant, fulfilling all of the standards of procedurally just policing. But despite this, the boys were terrified. As she approached, Richard was worried that his little cousin, his cousin was a bit younger than him and the rest of the boys, might be afraid. So he told his cousin, just stay calm, you with your big cousin, he got you. If they gotta take me, I'll tell them to take me, but to keep you out. So there was a sense, even though this was like a procedurally just interaction, that risk was present. And I think if you've experienced being stopped by the police as a Black person or someone from a marginalized community, you have probably experienced this sort of fear. So according to Richard's retelling, he said to the officer, we're not doing nothing wrong, we're just looking at the houses because we want to be able to live like them. So we're just looking at the houses like them. And then he remarked, that could have been our last day with each other because you never know. So then the officer checks their IDs, sees that there's nothing amiss, and lets them kind of continue on their journey. So from a policymaker's standpoint, nothing really happened here, right? So maybe a good thing happened. People saw something and said something, right? So they saw a suspicious group of boys walking around their neighborhood. They call the police show up, the police ask them questions and send the boys on their merry way, no harm, no foul. So from a policymaker's standpoint, nothing happened. But for Richard and his friends, they were all reminded of something that day, which is why Richard raised the story with us in the context of this interview, which is to say they were reminded of the profound precarity of their social situations. So they were reminded that this idea that they could go look and experience dreams that they didn't get to have in their usual homes in West Baltimore. Things like that, living in homes with pools and golf courses and all of this, was so off limits that when they tried to experience it for a few minutes, they were viewed suspiciously and the police were called, and they viewed their lives and their kind of freedom as being at risk that day. So that is what I would argue a mode of violence and a mode of exclusion that normal, usual conversations about police reform leave out. So this is what this kind of builds into this theory of what I call legal estrangement. So the theory starts with, and of course acknowledges, the importance of individual interactions. I'm not, I should say, saying that reforms like procedural justice are unimportant and other things like them that are kind of designed to enhance legitimacy of the police. They're not per se wrong, but they do take up a lot of space that distracts us from dealing with the other levels of legal estrangement. So the second would be what I call vicarious marginalization. And that, I think the nice way, a nice way of kind of boiling that down is this idea of collective memory. So, when people experience police violence or police rudeness in all of its multiple forms, we don't just keep it to ourselves, we share it with other people. And in doing so, and of course, in the generational knowledge that we pass down, I mean, a lot of people, I think a lot of people have become aware of something called the talk for the past year or so. I've started to hear people, have conversations about the talk that Black parents often have with their Black children. But and that's part of this process of vicarious marginalization, is the fact that none of the police reforms that tend to be proposed do anything about the generational knowledge and collective memory of police violence, and especially Black communities, but of course not exclusively Black communities, especially if we're thinking about kind of Native American marginalization and policing, et cetera. Also, the third level, and this is kind of where I focus a lot of my work, and this is what the segregation work is about, is that legal estrangement also involves a process of structural exclusion, and that's exclusion from good policing. So kind of as I was talking about earlier with Roland, he was aware that some people were getting the type of policing that made their lives better and then made them felt seen, and that he wasn't, and his community was not. But then the way this happens, there are multiple processes through which that process of structural exclusion happens. And so I've written a lot recently about segregation as being one way in which the structural harms and benefits of policing to some people, how they accrue, overlap with race-class segregation lines. But I'd be happy to talk more about that in Q&A. So this is to say, I think what we are seeing, and this is what the movement is really responding to, is the fact that you cannot just kind of do police reform that is focused on individual interactions when the problems are structural, generational, and they have more to do with group-based exclusion than with individual kind of bad interactions. Okay, so and then the other point there too, I should mention here, and this is something that we are not quite dealing with yet, which is that the understanding, like what we understand police violence to be, is physical violence, shooting, killing. We think about Derek Chauvin and the visible physical brutality he displayed for George Floyd. We don't think enough about the types of stories that I was telling you with Roland and with Richard, which are stories about routine, persistent structural violence and institutional violence that that essentially mean that that the very daily work of policing sends a kind of contributes to processes of legal estrangement, and that is what people and movements are concerned about. Not only the most egregious physical kind of incidents of physical violence. So, but I should say those instances of physical violence are inevitable, and they're going to continue to happen if we don't deal with these kind of underlying structural issues. So that moves me to a conversation about the change that is needed. So where does all of this take us? There's something, and this is displayed in the story of Louisville. It's also displayed in the story of Baltimore. So I'm not sure if any of you will really remember the 2015 Obama White House's presidential task force on policing. And they kind of interviewed a number of people, and one of the people who testified was the then police chief of Baltimore, and was testifying about the kind of positive things they were doing. So many police departments have attempt to engage in police reform. And some of that is, for cover, but I think a lot more of it is sincere. I think, one of the things we really have to focus on is that a lot of police officers and police leaders even don't see themselves as enemies to justice. They don't see themselves as racist, but they don't quite understand the inevitable racism, the institutional racism of the way policing is carried out and its very kind of goals and functions. And so one of the questions one might have is how do you do structural solutions? What is the relevant approach? And so, and this is a hard one for lawyers and law professors, but here's the thing. One of the key things we understand from a legal estrangement perspective, and also specifically focusing on that structural exclusion piece, is that policing never operates on its own. So you actually can't do police reform on its own and expect to see the change we need. So there are lots of incremental reforms, of course, that are important. So Suzette talked about testifying against qualified immunity. That is a really important reform. It has to do with the amount of accountability that one might have in an incident in which police engage in unconstitutional behavior. That is an important reform, but you can do that, and you can do a lot of kind of internal to policing reforms, and you will still see what we have seen recently with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, et cetera. Like, we will continue to see these incidents because what police fundamentally do is maintain racial hierarchy, engage in surveillance, and kind of maintain the status quo. And we live in a status quo of racial hierarchy. So that means that instead of starting from a question of how do we reform the police, how can the Louisville Police Department finally, after 40 years, be racially just, that is not the right question. The right question is, how do we build a safe community? And then we might have a number of different component parts operating together. So this comes from a core point, which is that we cannot do, basically we have to see police in context. We cannot view police as an institution that can be internally reformed. And of course, some incremental reforms within policing are helpful, but we will not achieve racial justice through policing. And so that switch in questions is a key move that movement actors are making. So not how to reform police, but how to construct public safety. A second really key move is thinking much more about power and process. So a lot of police reform is engaged in by police leaders and technocrats and scholars on policing, and not so much in conversation with community members. And I should be really clear. When I say conversation, I don't mean conversation. I mean actually giving reins of power and control to community members. And so here's the thing, that's a complicated type of proposal. I mean, I think an easy response here is to say, well, what community members? It turns out many community members are punitive, they're racist, they have problematic sort of views, and they don't really understand how things happen. That might be fine, but what we have seen in the space of policing is that part of the reason reforms don't work is because the processes exclude the people who they most directly affect. And that means that this legitimacy problem, it can't really be resolved because, and of course, this also has to do with limiting the power of policing. So one of the really important moves we've seen take much more national traction over the past few weeks is disentangling policing, the kind of like understanding that people want public safety, but not believing that policing is the only way to get there. And that type of impulse comes from a movement perspective that is oriented more around the needs and concerns of community and less about the views of technocrats and which boxes and silos different agendas fall into. So along those lines, I just want to say a quick word in the last few minutes about solutions that have been proposed by movement actors more recently, which are defund and abolition. I think many of us who've been paying a lot of attention to these incidents have been hearing a lot about the movement to defund the police. And of course, and I think in the first stages, there are lots of questions like, what do you mean defund the police? Do you mean removing all funding from the police? Or, what, like, so, and I'm happy to talk more in detail about what some of those proposals look like. But I think some of the answers are, yes, for some people, this means completely defund the police and completely invest in alternatives to alternative ways to build public safety. So for some people, that means removing some of the funding. I think we've seen a lot of local government barriers to actually doing anything around defund. But I just want to say now, what is so important about the defund perspective if you see that legal estrangement is the problem. What defund does is have us interrogate the centrality of policing to how we think about public safety, to social life, and critically, especially in marginalized communities where, without, a lot of people who live in predominantly white communities seeing this, what's happened is that policing kind of has become a form, kind of an alternative form of government, so that and that's in marginalized communities and also not in marginalized communities. I can give examples of that during Q&A if you'd like, but there's a way in which over the past 30 years, because of the professionalization of police forces and because of certain changes that were made in federal law and also like ideas from the academy and community policing, like all of these kind of theoretical, funding, and political considerations have made policing a central part of governance far beyond the scope of anything that one would call crime. And the defund movement is critical to having people rethink that centrality, to actually having pushback at a local government level on that centrality in ways that I think we haven't quite seen. And we haven't seen it very strongly, which is why you kind of get into these cycles of 40 years of reform and no real change, is because we have these kind of locked in ideological perspectives on who does public safety, and now defund is forcing us to think about them differently. I also want to say a bit about abolition as well. So it's been really exciting to see over the past couple of months, serious conversations about abolition happening outside of kind of like leftist and radical kind of the political groups and movement groups, and to see people really interrogating the notion of abolition. Now, one thing that's really important, and I draw here on the work of Allegra McLeod and thinking about the ethic of abolition and how critical that is. So, I think especially for a law audience, and this is true with defund as well, it's like, okay, well, what are the actual action plans? Do people all agree on what abolition is going to mean and what defund is going to mean? And I can't speak on behalf of movement actors with respect to questions like that. But what I can say is that all of these movements and all of these ideas are about shifting our goals and shifting our perspective. So away from micro level perspectives that get individual police officers to behave differently toward individuals, away from solutions that are really invested in making policing less harmful for a moment without seeing the bigger picture. The conversation that's happening now around both defund and abolition is having us interrogate our goals, to think not just how do we reduce the harm of policing right now, which again, I think is very important. I'm on board with reforms that are about reducing the harm of policing. But at the same time, having in mind bigger goals that are about reducing the centrality of policing in our world, that are about rearranging these structures, including policing, seeing policing as a structure that is not a public safety institution gone wrong, but is instead one of many institutions that have been designed fundamentally and that operate in a technical way, very fundamentally, to maintain racial hierarchy, to maintain segregation, class hierarchy, and therefore the goal is to rein it in, not to improve it or to think there is possible to make it virtuous. And so I'm gonna stop there and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Of all the attendees, please look into the chat function or the Q&A to submit questions, and then we look forward to hearing more from Professor Bell. I just wanted to ask you at the outset about two things, Monica. One, just a response to a story that's been in the news from Gwinnett County, Georgia. There's this white police officer who responded to a call of a vandalized car, went to a woman's house, a Black woman's house, drug her off of her porch into the bushes and tased her in front of her family. And it's on video. In the midst of that chaos, her family is heard screaming on the film, like, call the cops. And it just like struck me so hard about, this trust while the cops are literally in the midst of tasing their sister, their mother in the bushes, very violently. They're yearning for the police to come and kind of help them. And there's this weird tension, I think, in that trust relationship. And then kind of on the other side of that, thinking about how that translates into reform, I just wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit more about how the police coordinate with other bureaucracies. So one of my understandings of the defund the police is that the funding would be moved into other community services that would address the underlying problems that we don't need to criminalize, for example. But I found it really persuasive in your new anti-segregation paper, this evidence that policing or police forces coordinate with existing bureaucracies to further entrench racial hierarchy. And why should we have any trust that moving funds from the police to other bureaucracies will require the police to then coordinate with them? Why should we trust that that coordination will be a net positive and not a net negative?
So those are great questions. I'm going to start with the first. So one thing about the Gwinnett County story that I think is important is, so saying call the cops when the cops are tasing your mother is not trust, actually. I think that is and so I've actually written a bit about this in an article in 2016 called Situational Trust. And I use the word trust to describe this as well, but I think it's a bit of a misnomer. It's actually desperation, and it speaks to the devolution of all kinds of other means for maintaining control over one's kind of environment. And it also speaks more broadly to the ideology of policing. So I think, sometimes people have this idea that marginalized communities, Black people, brown people who have been negatively affected, queer people who have been negatively affected by policing, never say things like call the cops and never call the cops. But that's actually not true. I mean, the statistics don't bear that out. Even controlling for differences in quote unquote crime rates, statistics, seem to support the idea that that actually Black communities kind of have a higher rate of police calling. And that speaks in some ways to the nature of the story you were just telling, which is there is a broader dispossession. There is an ideology of policing that is quite powerful. And even those who are most subjected to its negative effects also experience things in this way. So, I should also mention, I was recently reading a paper where someone told a similar sort of story and said that in order to manage the police, in order to manage their own fears about police, sometimes they would say, okay, well, I'm going to call the police in order to so they can police each other. So I guess there are multiple things about this. So one would be that we have to stop. Like, I think there's this really problematic tendency for leaders, especially police leaders, to talk to community members. And if you go to a community meeting, and I've experienced this in doing my research over and over again, people say, well, we need more policing. We need the police to like keep us safe, et cetera. But not understanding that, and this is kind of like James Foreman's story in his book as well, not understanding that people are speaking to a concern of feeling unsafe. They're not really always saying we actually want more policing because they know that the police are making them unsafe. And so really understanding communities' concerns and kind of engaging this process of community power will help with things like that, instead of saying, well, I've taken a survey and they said they want more police, is like a really impoverished way of seeing these issues. The second piece, though I want to, if I take this like call the cops on the cops seriously, I would say, and this kind of speaks again to some of the advocacy that Suzette mentioned doing in terms of bystanders, and as we saw in the George Floyd case, one would think that that other police presence could help rein in the horrible behavior of certain police individuals. Like, one would hope that that this would be a way of countering some aspects of police culture that support the behavior of violence against marginalized people. So this is to say that I'm not at all surprised by any aspect of the Gwinnett County story, and I think it just speaks to how impoverished our ways of thinking are about what public safety means. Now, moving to the next question you raised about coordinating with other bureaucracies. So yes, you're right. Defund is about not just defunding, but also investing. And that's a piece of the story that, especially in the early days of the conversation, people were missing. I didn't repeat that because I'm just like, oh, I think we all know that now, but I probably should have said more about that. But yeah, so defund is about basically divest and invest, which is kind of a movement principle that has been existent for decades. And the question is always, of course, what to invest in. And so your question raises a really interesting point, which is that when funding is shifted, for example, from policing to the housing authority, because we want to like maybe deal with public safety issues by having better access to housing, that funding is also often going to policing in kind of like an alternative route. There is a lot of coordination between policing and other institutions. So one way that movement actors have been thinking about this, and I think this is critical, the invest in alternative can be read in two ways, or at least two. Actually, I'm going to say at least three. So one of those ways would be kind of what you were describing, which is like, well, we should invest in social services agencies. This is something actually that Dorothy Roberts wondered about recently, which is to say, it's like, oh, well, don't just like give money to child protective services or something, like these kind of alternative institutions that are often, in fact, operating in carceral fashion. That is not the goal of a divest invest framework. It's like you have to be careful what you're investing in. But one way is to say, okay, let's invest in alternative state institutions that have been defunded with no kind of concern and that don't do their jobs very well. Another way of thinking about this is let's invest in alternatives that are that have been proven to work. So certain types of community organizations. So I'm actually thinking now, for example, about the LEAD in Seattle, but it's also kind of like a national, there's a national bureau, which used to stand for Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, but now has been changed to kind of let everyone advance with dignity. That's the new acronym meaning. And basically what LEAD is an organization that used to coordinate with the police, now sort of kind of doesn't, but the entire point is like case management for behavioral health. And they are expert in that. And you could think, okay, well, we have these organizations that have been doing this sort of work. They have been cooperating with police. These are white-led organizations. They have a lot of funding, but they do have a lot of expertise. Let's invest in something like that. And so it basically really is about having alternatives to policing that have like evidence behind them that in a certain sort of way. And then a third way, and I think this is actually the way a lot of movement actors think about this, is more, I would argue, from a kind of a reparations framework, which is to say, give this money to Black-led organizations or organizations that are led by marginalized communities in order for them to figure out what the community needs in order to promote public safety. And so the motive there is less about evidence-based and is more about justice in particular, and kind of racial justice in particular sorts of ways. And of course, none of these three ways is mutually exclusive, but this is to say that defund means all of these things. And one of the questions, I think, for the long-term success of the movement is how to balance a lot of these sorts of issues. But at the end of the day, it's certainly not about like investing in, one of the bureaucracies that routinely coordinates with the police in order to carry out oppression.
Excellent, thank you so much. So there's 5 questions in the queue. And just About 15 minutes, just as a kind of a time thing.
I can be shorter.
Keep coming in. No, you're fine. This is amazing. So H.O. Robbins writes, I'm wondering about the role of attorneys in the law in general to enforce and effectuate the systemic racism of policing. So the question is, because we have indifferent DAs, essentially, violent police officers are not arrested or indicted, but if without indifferent DAs, violent police officers would be arrested, indicted, and maybe enthusiastically prosecuted. Without racist and indifferent judicial doctrines, illegal policing would be penalized, either through compensatory recovery or actual exclusion of evidence or other things. So not saying that reforming the law would fix racism inherent in policing, especially from the abolitionist perspective, but do you think it would be an effective way to hobble it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, my perspective is that as long as there are DAs and as long as we have kind of the system we have, using it to increase accountability of officers is probably a good idea. This is why I support ending qualified immunity. This is why I would support, I've kind of contributed to progressive DA campaigns and all of this is because we do need to foster a structure that can move toward kind of the goals that we would like to see in the long term. And so I think the issue, and this is so I think the key issue is that a lot of lawyers who do stuff like that, we all want to think that whatever we're doing in our work is justice. We don't necessarily want to think about our work as just standing in the way of harm. Of greater harm. And prosecutors in particular, people who become prosecutors want to see themselves as representing the people. And I think now about Preet Bharara's book, which I think is called Doing Justice, right? This is a prosecutor's self-conception. And I don't think that's what would be happening. They wouldn't be doing justice. They would be reducing the harm of an unjust system. I think that is valuable. It's supported. I support it. But we have to not do that lawyer thing where we think, we're going to save the world. It's like, we're going to reduce the harm of the world. And I'm okay with that.
Excellent. All right. There's a couple of questions here related to public opinion polling. So I just want to put them both out there kind of at the same time. So one says that a recent Gallup poll showed a majority of Black Americans, 81%, wanted the same or more policing in their neighborhoods. How could one reconcile this result with the collective understanding that you've cited of Black experience with policing? The second one is more specific, maybe about tactics, and that is that the public support for this message, defund the police, has not really gained a lot of traction in public opinion polling. Are you concerned that the messaging might undermine some of the reforms? There's an interview with Karen Bass that cited too, where she said that she prefers the message refund communities instead of defund the police. Maybe something like that. Do you think that would be more effective? And then since we're cobbling a couple of questions together, I'll just throw in here that Ashley says she'd love to hear your opinions about the influence that culture may have on white Americans and how they see the police, and maybe your thoughts about the cancellation of cops from TV and kind of the way that police are culturally portrayed and how that, either the reform has changed people's views or the existence of that for the past decades has formed people's views.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'm going to start, I'm going to work my way back. So the fact that, it should not be surprising to you, I think that Black people, while experiencing everything I've talked about and everything that we know, also support having more policing in their communities. And this is because we are just like everyone else, and we want public safety. And there's been this tether between policing and public safety, and everyone is just trying to make do. And the thing is, we have to have a longer historical lens. This constant presence of policing in Black communities has not always been the case. And in fact, if you go back and look at work from the 1970s and 1980s, the story was more one about abandonment by police and not so much about kind of hyper presence, and that's been a shift. And so that polling. So here's the thing: I've interviewed so many people in so many cities who sometimes even talk about experiencing the direct violence, physical violence of police, and nonetheless also say they want more and better policing in their communities. And this is because there's an idea that it's possible to reform the police, like that it's possible to not have a violent police force that is racially harmful. And so I think that's a real question, but that is how I would explain that dynamic. And this is something, if you kind of want to read anything more about that, I'm going to stop talking about that because I'm going to move on to the next question. I have a lot more to say, but in my recently published article in the American Journal of Sociology called Located Institutions, I discuss the way that Black people, even those who have been negatively affected by policing, see policing as part of the American dream. So yes, of course, 81% of Black people would have that perspective. And it's possible to hold both of those things at the same time. The second question having to do with public support for defund. Yeah, so that's a really important question. So I will say, I can't speak for movement actors. I don't really totally feel comfortable kind of critiquing the movement for however they're framing things. I will say I'm not surprised at all that the phrase defund the police and the slogan isn't working for the majority of Americans because it is a new idea. And so I think instead of examining opinion polls to figure out the effectiveness of movements, movements have a longer term, there's a longer game. It's about eventually over time changing our narrative about what's possible. Can you imagine 5 years ago, kind of in the first big round of Black Lives Matter, defund the police even being a national slogan? I certainly can't. And I think that is a better way to assess the effectiveness of a strategy and less so much about opinion polling in this current moment. And I think also movements function to educate people, to organize, to build up coalitions, and also to push things as far as is possible to go so that the reforms or changes that are made are closer to those goals. That's like the political function. And then this final point, this final question about culture and white people. Oh, this is a great question. As someone who grew up having to be forced to watch Cops, I think one of the things that's really powerful and exciting to me in this moment is the fact that some white people at least are slowly starting to see what we've been talking about for so long, are slowly starting to see that it's not like that they're human beings who are being negatively affected by policing in these certain sorts of ways. So I think things like videos, things like kind of cultural products. This is why law is not kind of enough on its own. We need to have fundamental ideological shift. And this is why, like, when I talk to people about like, how are we going to reform these systems more broadly, it has to do with reading and education and all these other kind of structural features that kind of contribute to the ideology of policing as being this kind of protected force and protected institution in our society.
Monica, could I jump in for a sec?
Yeah, that's
yeah. If we don't have any other questions from students, we're good, Doug? Okay. Yeah, I am really appreciating your comments, and I wanted to think a little bit about this whole notion of the, I guess one of the proposals that myself and a couple of people have written about is this notion of bystander police liability, and trying to come up with a way, thinking of how do you, I don't know, how do you change the culture? I think what's one of the things that's kind of painful is if you go back to 1871 with the Ku Klux Klan Act, and back then we had Section 1985 that had envisioned this notion of having bystander cops be liable. And of course that has been squashed over time and interpreted in a way that makes that, you know, that notion needs to be sort of dusted off, that idea. But I think, as you mentioned, quite powerfully and importantly, is that you know, these are reforms, they're on their edges, they're sort of tinkering, what can you do with law? That law is limited in terms of changing behaviors. But it was a way of trying to get at this blue coat of silence, right? This just fierce loyalty among the police officers, including Black officers and white officers. So just trying to get at that, break that somehow. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about how do you actually change the culture of policing and the priorities, because there's clearly a value system that underlines what's going on, which, you know, law to some degree can impact on the margins because you're hurting people where it counts in their pocketbook, but clearly doesn't get at the underlying problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I had to think about reforms that can kind of happen right now that that kind of help weaken police, like I actually don't think it's possible to upend all of police culture, but I do think it's possible to weaken some factors. So I really like the idea of bystander liability. There are a few other things. So one, and I've written a bit about this, is processes of reckoning or reconciliation. So these would be apologizing, acknowledging, and also building relationship in kind of like a shifting power kind of way, community members around the racial harms of policing. Like acknowledge, like the police can actually acknowledge that what they have done is perpetuate racism. And in the Obama era, that was starting to happen, so that the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police engaged in an apology. This is starting to happen in a few places around the country, but often for specific incidents, like, you know, a lynching that happened that was not investigated, for example. That's a common one. Also, the police chief in Stockton has made this sort of apology. Stockton, California has made these sort of apologies. I think what that does is one of the things, police officers get really angry when they're being called racist. I think, you know, everyone does, but I think police officers in particular, because they think, you know, I risk my life every day in these communities, and now they're just calling me a racist. But this process of reckoning can help even them understand that we're not talking about individual racism. Like, this is a way, you know, we're talking about institutions, we're talking about basic functions. And so I think this culture of not denying racism and just kind of seeing oneself as individually oppressed is something that needs to change. Related to that is police leadership. So I think in the same way that prosecutors are really important, it turns out there are also people who think about themselves as progressive police chiefs. And while, you know, I would not carry the banner for progressive police chiefs in the way that I don't carry the banner for progressive DAs, I do think they play a really important role in kind of reducing the harms of policing by dictating culture, especially because policing is such a hierarchical institution. It's actually possible to make cultural change in part through leadership. So that's another place I would focus. And then the third, and this is maybe a little bit more out there, but I just think it's important to mention, which is like the militarization and the kind of weaponry associated with police. It's like SWAT teams, the kind of the amount of military grade shields and weaponry that police have, that sends a message to police officers. And that message is that you are under siege and your primary goal is to protect yourself from the onslaught of Black people and other marginalized people. That type of framework is endemic to police culture, and it's something that's been ratcheted up since the 1980s. And so these are things that these are things that could actually, I think, shift, even if not totally upend, the racist aspects of police culture.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. That last piece actually, I think, addressed some of the other questions that had come in. Like Matthew Von Werder had a question about this earlier. We have about 90 seconds left. So this is, of course, the place to ask you the biggest, most complicated question. But there's a question that if the purpose of current policing is one of social control, it sounds like there's some elements of that and the anecdotal experiences that you shared, how is that going to hinder attempts, or how can we still imagine there being attempts to change these institutions from the bottom? The institutions are there to control us so that we can't do that specifically.
Yeah, so I think we have to, so the way I would approach it is like, we're not changing these institutions. It's about shifting what the relevant institutions are. Like, I actually think what that question is getting to the reason that community engagement. So there's this theory in urban planning about kind of the hierarchy of community involvement. I'm actually messing up the name, but you could have kind of a control perspective, or you could have various step down that things that have to do with engagement and voice. This is like civilian review boards that were a popular reform in the past, especially a kind of resurgence. All of these are about doing exactly what the question is getting to, which is like trying to take an institution that is profoundly resistant to outside influence and trying to use community bottom-up ways of getting there. This is actually why it's really important for local politicians and things like this to invest in alternatives. So it's not just about communities trying to gain control over an institution that is designed for social control. So basically, I'm empathetic with the question's impulse.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We had, the most disappointing part of a Zoom call is there's no way for us to applaud. There's 78 people on the call, from Connecticut to Idaho to Colorado. So we appreciate you so much taking your time to speak to us today, and wish you all the best and hope that we're able to stay in touch. Thank you on behalf of the White Center in Colorado.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Professor Bell.